The lawyer's call came 3 hours after I buried my grandmother. She had left me $12 million and a letter explaining exactly why my family would try to steal it before the week was out. I was standing in a hospital parking lot in Pittsburgh, still in my scrubs, and I remember thinking the pavement looked wrong, like it had shifted slightly while I wasn't paying attention. I didn't say anything for a long moment. The November air was cold enough that my breath was visible, small white clouds dissolving before they got far, and my scrubs still smelled like antiseptic and recycled hospital air, the way they always do at the end of a shift. My phone had a hairline crack running from the bottom right corner up toward the center of the screen, something I had been meaning to fix for 3 weeks, and I stared at that crack while the man on the other end of the line waited. Small details become very important when large things are happening. I understand that now in a way I didn't before that afternoon. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 27 years old, and I work as a hospital administrator at St. Mary's Medical Center on Forbes Avenue. I know what rehearsed information sounds like. I spend half my professional life delivering it. The man on the phone had rehearsed this conversation. His name was David Hargrove, of Hargrove and Associates, and he had been holding this specific moment in reserve for a day that had now arrived. My grandmother, Eleanor Mitchell, had died at 7:14 that morning. I had stood at her graveside 3 hours earlier at Allegheny Cemetery and held myself completely together through the service and the burial and the drive back to work because I had a 2 o'clock meeting. I felt I couldn't cancel. And now I was standing in a parking lot being told she had left me $12 million and a written warning about my own family. And something about that particular combination pulled an apology out of me before I could examine whether it made sense. "I'm sorry," I said. Not to him, just out loud. "Take your time," Hargrove said. He sounded like he genuinely meant it. The first question I asked, I'm still proud of. Not how much, not when can I access it, not are you absolutely certain. I asked, how long has this existed? There was a pause before he answered. The kind of pause that carries more information than the words that follow it. The Irrevocable Trust was formally established on March 14, 2019 at First Commonwealth Bank in Pittsburgh. Account number 7,734 to 2,291. But Eleanor began building the financial foundation considerably earlier than that. 2019 is when it became a legal instrument. The roots go back much further. $12 million. I said it quietly to myself, not from excitement, but because I needed to hear it in my own voice to confirm it was real. The November sky over the parking structure was doing something pale and flat, the kind of winter light that doesn't so much illuminate as flatten everything it touches. A pigeon was investigating something near the drainage grate at the far end of the lot with the absolute focus of a creature for whom none of this was happening. The ordinary world was continuing without any adjustment whatsoever. Eleanor Mitchell was 84 years old. She served as an army nurse during the Korean War, stationed near Busan from 1952 to 1953, in field hospitals that processed casualties at a pace nobody back home was asked to think about. She came home in 1953, to a country that handed her a veteran's pension, thanked her quietly, and moved on. She never married. She lived the last 31 years of her life in a 2-bedroom apartment on Maple Court in Cranberry Township, and that apartment was the subject of more condescending commentary at family gatherings than I can accurately count. Her government check. That was my father Robert's phrase, delivered at roughly every other Thanksgiving with the patient tone of someone explaining an unfortunate reality to a room that already understood it. My Aunt Carol once suggested, loudly, at my cousin Jared's graduation dinner, that Eleanor probably didn't understand compound interest. Nobody corrected her. I remember looking at Eleanor when Carol said that. Eleanor was cutting her chicken. She didn't look up. She didn't look up, and I didn't say anything, and I have thought about that moment every single day since November 3rd. "She left a letter," I said. "You mentioned a letter." "Yes, sealed. She was specific that it be delivered to you in person, at my office, after you had been informed of the full financial details. She wanted you to have the complete picture first." He paused. "She also asked me to tell you something directly. Her words, not mine. She said, 'They never saw me. Make sure Sarah does.'" Something shifted behind my sternum, not breaking, more like a structure settling under new weight. "How long did you know her?" I asked. 19 years. She first came to my office in March of 2004. A smaller pause this time. I was aware of the family dynamics for most of that period. She kept detailed notes. She was a very precise woman. I need to stop here for a second, because I want you to understand what those 19 years mean. While my father called her a financial burden at Christmas dinner, she was sitting across from an attorney on Grant Street, building documentation of exactly what was being said about her, and by whom. While my aunt made jokes about compound interest, Eleanor was directing compound interest into an account that had been growing since before I started high school, 19 years. Not a sudden decision. Not a reaction. A sustained, deliberate, 19-year answer to people who had already decided what she was worth. Before I keep going, if you've ever had someone in your family dismissed the way Eleanor was dismissed, I want to hear about it in the comments. Tell me about them. Their name, what they built, what your family missed. And if this story is already making your chest tight, you might want to subscribe now because it gets considerably heavier before it gets better. I walked to my car and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. The parking lot moved around me with the ordinary business of a hospital afternoon. A delivery truck backing toward the loading dock. A nurse I recognized from the third floor walking toward the entrance with her head down against the wind. 2 pigeons now. Everything normal. Nothing normal. My father had called 3 times while I was on the phone with Hargrove. My mother twice. My cousin Jared had sent a text at 4:02 p.m., 18 minutes after I had learned about the trust. It said only, "We need to talk about Grandma's things." 18 minutes. I started the car and drove toward Birchwood Lane because that was where everyone had gathered, and because I needed to see what I was walking into before I walked into it. The Mitchell family home sits on a slight rise at the end of the street, and you can see the front window clearly from the driveway approach. I pulled in slowly and let the engine idle. The lights were on. 3 cars I recognized at the curb. Jared's truck still running, exhaust drifting white in the cold evening air, like he had arrived somewhere fast and hadn't bothered to turn it off because he didn't plan to stay long. Through the front window, visible from where I sat, my father Robert stood in the living room with Eleanor's oak memory box in his hands. The one with the small brass lock engraved with Korean characters along the side. The one Eleanor had shown me once, years ago, holding it with both hands, and said in a tone I had never heard her use about anything else, "This is mine. No one opens it but me. You remember that?" He had his thumbnail wedged into the lock. I sat in the driveway with the engine running and watched my father try to force open the one thing my grandmother had asked to keep private, and I thought about 19 years of silence and $12 million and a sealed letter waiting for me in a lawyer's office 2 blocks from the courthouse. Then I turned off the engine and reached for the door. Every car was already there. Jared's truck still running at the curb, exhaust drifting white in the cold air, like he'd arrived fast and hadn't bothered to shut it off. My parents' Buick backed in close to the garage. Aunt Carol's silver Camry parked at an angle that suggested she had not been thinking about parking when she arrived. I sat in my car for 40 seconds. I counted them deliberately, the way you count things when you need your mind occupied with something small so it doesn't collapse under something large. I had learned in the parking lot on Forbes Avenue that my grandmother had left me $12 million and a warning about her own family. I had driven 31 minutes to this house knowing what I knew and knowing they didn't know I knew it. That gap between what I understood and what they assumed was the only advantage I had, and I needed to be careful not to spend it in the first 30 seconds. At 5:53 p.m., before I opened the car door, I pressed record on my phone's voice memo app and slid it into my left jacket pocket with the microphone facing out. Then I got out of the car. The front door opened before I reached the porch steps. Someone had been watching the driveway. My mother Linda stood in the doorway with a dish towel in her hand, and the smell that came out around her was cream of mushroom soup and paprika, her chicken casserole, the one she made for every occasion that required management. Hospital discharges, moving days, funerals. Eleanor had been dead for 10 hours and 23 minutes, and my mother had already made the casserole. I registered that and kept walking. The living room of 412 Birchwood Lane looked like the early stages of an estate sale conducted by people trying very hard to appear as though they were not conducting an estate sale. My father Robert stood near the fireplace with Eleanor's oak memory box in his hands, the brass lock engraved with Korean characters catching the lamplight. His right thumbnail was bent at an angle and the skin around it had gone red, the particular red of something that has been pressed and rubbed against resistance for a while. He had been working at that lock for some time. Eleanor's Korean War Service uniform was still in its frame on the far wall, but the frame had been shifted several inches to the right and now hung crooked, the bottom left corner lifting slightly away from the wall, the way things look when someone moved something nearby without paying attention to what was already there. Eleanor kept that frame level. She straightened it every time I visited. The crooked frame bothered me in a way I did not have words for yet. My Aunt Carol was in the dining room crouching beside Eleanor's small writing table, running her palm along the underside of the wood, tilting it slightly to examine the joints. She didn't look up when I came in. Eleanor had owned that table for 40 years. Carol had never once asked about it while Eleanor was alive. Eleanor's reading glasses were on the kitchen counter near the coffee maker. One lens was slightly smudged. She had set them down at some point, and someone had moved them here to clear a surface. And now they sat in that specific abandoned way that objects take on when the person who used them every day is not coming back to pick them up. I looked at them longer than I should have, and then I made myself stop. "Good, you're here," Linda said, coming out of the kitchen. Not "I'm glad you came," not "how are you holding up." "Good, you're here," the way you say it when the last logistical piece has arrived. She didn't really have anything worth the trouble of a will, she added, turning back toward the kitchen before I could respond. Not a question. A conclusion she had already reached and was now filing aloud. I set my bag on the entryway bench and said nothing. I was recording. I needed to be deliberate about what I added to that audio. Robert set the memory box on the mantel when I came further into the room, but he kept his hand on top of it, fingers spread, the way you set something down when you haven't finished with it and want the room to understand that. "Your grandmother didn't leave anything formal," he said. "We're just getting organized. Should have moved her to a state facility in 2019, he added after a pause just long enough to indicate it had been considered rather than simply said. Would have saved everyone a lot of back and forth. I looked at him. I kept my voice level. "When did you last visit her, Dad?" What followed was 3 full seconds of silence. I counted those too. Robert Mitchell coached a regional sales team for 11 years. He answers questions for a living. 3 seconds is not a natural pause for a man like that. 3 seconds is a calculation. "That's beside the point," he said. It was the most honest thing he said all evening. My cousin Jared was at the far end of the dining room table with his jacket still on. He was 31, worked in insurance 3 miles from here, and had the specific energy of someone who had just finished a phone call and was waiting for the next development. He had a document in front of him, several printed pages, white paper with the slightly bright finish of HP OfficeJet output. When I appeared in the doorway, he slid it toward my father in a gesture casual enough to appear incidental and specific enough to be entirely deliberate. My father picked it up, glanced at the first page, and placed it face down on the table in one practiced motion. The document was handwritten, I could see that much from where I stood. Handwriting slightly degraded the way it looks when it has been photographed and printed rather than read from the original source. I did not look at it directly. I looked at the casserole dish visible through the kitchen doorway. I looked at the ceiling. I tracked the document in my peripheral vision and understood exactly what it was. Then something happened that I have thought about many times since. Linda came out of the kitchen and crossed to the far wall. She reached up and straightened Eleanor's uniform frame, both hands on the sides, adjusting it until it was level. She did it quietly, without announcing it, without looking at anyone. When it was straight, she stood in front of it for a moment with her hands still raised, not quite touching it anymore, just close. "She always kept this straight," she said. "Not to me, not to Robert, to no one in particular, or maybe to the room, or maybe to herself." Nobody responded. Linda lowered her hands and went back to the kitchen. I filed that moment and kept it. 20 minutes later, I excused myself to use the bathroom. I walked down the hall, closed the door, turned the faucet on, and called David Hargrove. He answered on the first ring. "I've been waiting for your call," he said. No greeting. He had expected exactly this. "Don't touch the box. Do not let them open it. And whatever document you just saw passed between your cousin and your father, photograph it before you leave tonight. Carefully, without being seen." "I've been recording since I walked in," I said. A pause. shorter than the ones my father specialized in. When Hargrove spoke again, his voice had shifted slightly, towards something that might have been satisfaction. "Good," he said. "She chose well. I need to stop here for a second. I need you to understand what was happening in that house." My grandmother had been dead for less than 12 hours. Her uniform frame was crooked from being moved out of the way. Her reading glasses were on the counter with a smudged lens. Her memory box was on the fireplace mantel with the lock scratched from being forced. And her family had already produced a document they intended to use to redirect everything she had built, before she was cold, before the flowers at the cemetery had finished wilting. If you're angry right now, good. Drop a comment. Tell me what you would have done standing in that bathroom with the faucet running. I will read every single one. "There's something else," Hargrove said. I had been about to thank him and hang up. "The document your cousin brought tonight, I need you to understand something about it. Your grandmother filed a legal response to it 6 weeks ago, before she even died." I stood in Eleanor's bathroom with the water running and looked at myself in the mirror above the sink, the same mirror she had looked into every morning for 31 years. "She knew," I said. "She knew," Hargrove said. "She planned for it. All of it. I'll explain everything tomorrow morning. 9 o'clock. My office on Grant Street. But Sarah photographed that document tonight, and don't touch the box." I turned off the faucet. I put my phone in my pocket and stood in the quiet of Eleanor's bathroom for a moment, looking at the small soap dish on the edge of the sink, the folded hand towel, the reading light above the mirror she had probably switched on every morning for 3 decades. Then I unlocked the door and walked back out into the living room where my family was dividing up what they thought she had left behind. And I understood for the first time that they had no idea what they were actually dealing with. Neither did I yet. But tomorrow morning on Grant Street, I was about to find out. David Hargrove's office on Grant Street in downtown Pittsburgh smelled like old paper and wood polish, the kind of office that had been in the same building long enough to have absorbed the character of everyone who had ever worked inside it. Dark walnut shelves, binders with handwritten labels on the spines, a window behind his desk that looked out over the street at an angle suggesting the building predated the road's current width. It was the office of a man who had chosen permanence over impression, and that told me something about him before he said a word. I arrived at 9:11 a.m. on November 4th, 4 minutes early, because I had not slept, and leaving my apartment had felt more manageable than staying in it. I had the photograph of Jared's document on my phone. I had the voice recording from the night before. I had Eleanor's reading glasses in my jacket pocket. I had taken them from the kitchen counter when no one was watching, not for any legal reason, just because I could not leave them there. Hargrove stood when I came in, 61 years old, with the careful stillness of someone who had spent decades in rooms where people were in pain and had learned not to add to it. He gestured to the chair across from his desk and waited until I was settled before sitting down himself. A manila folder sat open in front of him, thick enough that the edges splayed. Beside it, a cream-colored envelope with Eleanor's handwriting on the front. He moved the envelope to the far corner of the desk when he noticed me looking at it. "That comes last," he said. She was specific about the order. He turned the folder toward me and began. Eleanor Mitchell's financial history, laid out in sequence, was not the story of someone who had been lucky. It was the story of someone who had been disciplined for 60 years in a way no one around her had thought to look for because they had already decided what she was. The Korean War veteran's survivor benefit had been deposited into a Pittsburgh National Bank savings account every month since October 1953, $47 a month at the beginning. By the time benefit adjustments accumulated over decades, it had reached $847 monthly by 2019. Eleanor had never touched the principal. She had let it accumulate for 34 years before doing anything with it, and what she did with it was not spend it. In September 1987, she sold a parcel of land in Allegheny County that her father had left her. A piece of property no one in the family had known existed, because no one had ever asked her what she owned. The deed was in the folder. $340,000. Transferred the same month to a money market account at Pittsburgh National Bank, later absorbed into PNC. I held the coffee cup Hargrove had set in front of me and did not drink from it. It went cold in my hand while I read. On January 14, 1989, Eleanor opened a Vanguard Index Fund account. Hargrove slid the original account documentation across the desk. Eleanor's signature at the bottom, small and precise. The same handwriting I had grown up reading on birthday cards and recipe cards, and the single letter she wrote me when I graduated college that I still keep in my desk drawer. She never talked about any of this, I said, not an accusation, just a fact that needed to occupy the room. No, Hargrove said. She was deliberate about that. He turned to the next section of the folder. In March 2019, the accumulated value of her accounts and investments was formalized into an irrevocable trust. At that point, the total was $8,200,000. She had been building for 30 years. He paused. By the time she passed on November 3rd with investment growth and continued contributions, the trust had reached $12 million. I set the coffee cup down. 30 years. Eleanor had been building something worth $12 million for 30 years while my father explained her government check to Thanksgiving dinner guests, while my aunt made jokes about compound interest. While the family debated, in Eleanor's presence, whether she might be more comfortable in an assisted living situation that wouldn't require anyone to check on her so regularly. Duke commented the comments, Hargrove said. She kept a notebook, dates, exact wording, who was present. He opened a marked section of the folder. Your father, in November 2009, at a dinner at your parents' home, told Eleanor that she was, and I am reading from her notes directly, nothing but a poor nurse who never amounted to anything. Your mother was present, your Aunt Carol, your cousin Jared, and you, though you were 13 at the time. He closed that section of the folder with the particular care of someone handling something that deserved it. She wrote it down that same night. The entry is 2 sentences. The insult. And then this. I will not carry their assessment of me. I will carry my answer to it. The office was very quiet. She never told me that, I said. No, Hargrove's voice was steady in the way that comes from long practice at delivering things people need to hear. She didn't want you carrying their cruelty as part of how you understood your own family. She wanted you to receive her answer to it, not the wound it was responding to. 13 years old, I was sitting at that dinner table in November 2009 when my father said that to my grandmother, and I did not remember it. I did not carry it. She did. She went home that night and wrote it down and turned it into the organizing principle of the next 14 years of her financial life. I had forgotten a dinner. She had built $12 million from it. If that lands for you the way it landed for me in that office, share this with someone today. Put it in front of them. Because what Eleanor did with that insult is something people need to understand. She didn't get angry. She didn't defend herself. She wrote it down and she built something with it instead. Someone in your life needs to hear that story. Hargrove moved to the next section. The forged will Jared had circulated the night before the HP OfficeJet pages. The traced handwriting had already been legally neutralized. Eleanor had filed a sealed affidavit with the Allegheny County Probate Court on September 9, 2023, 6 weeks before her death, specifically anticipating the introduction of fraudulent documentation after her passing. She had named potential parties. She had described potential methods. She had filed it and sealed it and said nothing about it to anyone except David Hargrove. She planned for all of it, Hargrove said. Anticipating something is passive. She was not passive. Then he mentioned one more thing, and the way he mentioned it carefully, with a pause before and after, told me it was not a side detail. Eleanor had included a specific designation in her will, $500,000 directed to the Pittsburgh VA Nursing Legacy Fund to be established as a named endowment. She had worked with the fund's director, a woman named Margaret Chen, for several months before her death to arrange the paperwork. The endowment was ready to be announced. It required only Sarah's confirmation as trustee to proceed. She wanted her name on something, Hargrove said. Something public. Something where the people who had dismissed her would have to see it and understand what they had been dismissing. He folded his hands on the desk. And she had a specific event in mind for the announcement. He paused. I'll explain that part when you're ready, but there's something you need to read first. He slid the cream-colored envelope across the desk, Eleanor's handwriting on the front. Just my name, Sarah, in the small, careful script I had grown up with. He turned it so I could see the back. In Eleanor's handwriting, now you know what they did. This is what I did instead. I held it in both hands and did not open it. Not yet. Not in a lawyer's office with yellow lamplight falling across 30 years of trust documents. Eleanor had waited 30 years to deliver her answer. I could wait a few more hours to receive it properly, but I was beginning to understand that whatever event she had chosen for that announcement, whatever room she had decided her name would be spoken in, my father and my Aunt Carol were going to be in it. Sarah called the family meeting herself. The text went out at 7:43 a.m. on November 5th, a single message to the group thread that had been active since Eleanor's death, and it said, 2 p.m. today, 412, Birchwood Lane. There are legal matters that require everyone present. She did not ask if the time worked. She did not follow up when no one responded for 40 minutes. She arrived at 1:48 p.m., 12 minutes early. David Hargrove was on her left, carrying a leather document case with the particular weight of things that cannot be undone. Pennsylvania State Police Financial Crimes Investigator Detective Karen Osei, badge number 4421, was on her right, in plain clothes, with a manila envelope under her arm and the specific stillness of someone who had done this many times and understood that silence, used correctly, was more effective than anything else she could bring into a room. I want to be honest about what I felt walking up that driveway, not triumph, not the satisfaction I might have expected. What I felt was clarity, the particular quality of attention that comes when you have prepared for something completely and arrived at the moment where preparation becomes action. Eleanor had spent 30 years preparing. I had spent 48 hours. But the principle was the same. Eleanor's uniform was straight on the wall when we walked in. Someone had straightened it before the meeting. I noticed that, and I knew who had done it, and I filed it alongside everything else I had been filing since Monday evening. The door opened before we reached it. Robert stood in the doorway, and his eyes moved from me to Hargrove to Detective Osei and back to me in a single sweep, and something in his expression shifted in a way he could not fully control. "Who is this?" he said. "David Hargrove, Eleanor Mitchell's attorney of 19 years, Hargrove said, extending his hand. "And Detective Osei from the Pennsylvania State Police Financial Crimes Unit. We appreciate everyone making time." Robert shook Hargrove's hand the way people shake hands when they are trying to appear as though they had expected this. He did not extend his hand to Detective Osei. He stepped back and let us in. The dining room table had been cleared. My mother Linda sat with both hands wrapped around a coffee cup, her posture the careful stillness of someone who had been thinking about how to sit for the last hour. Aunt Carol was to Linda's left with her handbag on her lap, which meant she had considered leaving and had not yet ruled it out. Cousin Jared was at the far end of the table, jacket on again, same as 2 nights before, looking at the table surface with the focused attention of someone who had decided not to make eye contact with anything until he understood what was happening. Hargrove set his document case on the table and opened it without ceremony. Eleanor Mitchell's last will and testament was certified by the Allegheny County Probate Court at 9:47 a.m. on November 4th, 2023, he said. He placed the certified copy on the table, centered, court stamp visible on the cover page. It is a single beneficiary document. The entire estate, including the irrevocable trust established at First Commonwealth Bank in March 2019, passes to Sarah Mitchell. There are no other named beneficiaries. Linda's hands tightened around the coffee cup. Robert was still standing near the living room doorway, arms folded, jaw set. "She was confused near the end," Robert said. The quality of the sentence was prepared, something rehearsed in the hours between my text and this moment. She was 84 years old and she wasn't well. She didn't know what she was signing. Hargrove did not raise his voice. He did not change his expression. He turned to the next page. Eleanor Mitchell signed her will on October 30th, 2023, in the presence of 2 independent witnesses and a licensed notary public at 525 Grant Street, Pittsburgh. The notary's certification is on page 3. He paused. October 30th was one day after she wrote a personal letter to Sarah, which required the same fine motor control and sustained concentration. She was lucid enough to complete both in a single 24-hour period. The notary's log is available to any court that requests it. NN May. Robert's jaw moved. Nothing came out. I had told myself I would not speak unless I needed to. I had told myself the documents would carry the weight, because that was what Eleanor had understood 30 years ago, and it was the lesson she left me alongside everything else. But I looked at my father standing in the doorway of his own dining room with his prepared argument dissolving in real time, and I thought about November 14th, 2009, and a 2-sentence notebook entry, and a woman who had gone home that night and decided to answer instead of hurt. "She saw everything, Dad," I said. My voice came out level. I was surprised by how level it came out. She saw all of it, for a very long time. She just chose not to say it while she was alive. I paused. That was the difference between the two of you. I had practiced that sentence exactly 0 times. It came out like it had been waiting somewhere, fully formed, since before I knew I needed it. If you've ever said the exact right thing at the exact right moment, you know what the silence that follows feels like. It has a particular weight. It lands differently than argument. It lands like something true. Subscribe if you want to hear what happened when Detective Osei stopped me on the way out, because what she told me changed the entire shape of the story I thought I was in. Detective Osei set the manila envelope on the table. She removed 2 documents and placed them side by side on the dark walnut surface. The paper was bright white, very crisp, stark against the wood. "I have a search warrant here, signed by Allegheny County Judge Patricia Holloway on November 4, 2023, authorizing retrieval of financial records associated with Robert Allen Mitchell in connection with an elder financial abuse investigation." She did not look up as she spoke. Specifically, "We are examining a series of withdrawals from Eleanor Mitchell's personal checking account at PNC Bank, totaling $23,400, made between January 2018 and October 2022, transferred into a personal Chase checking account registered to Robert Allen Mitchell. Eleanor Mitchell's documented medical expenses during that same period were covered entirely by her veterans' benefits and Medicare." Robert put one hand on the back of the nearest chair, not sitting, just needing something solid. "That money was for her care," he said. "The prepared quality was gone now. What replaced it was thinner." "The billing records tell a different story," Detective Osei said, without inflection. She turned toward Jared. "Mr. Mitchell, the document you introduced at a family gathering on the evening of November 3rd has been forensically examined. The ink is consistent with a printing date of November 1st, 2023, 2 days before Eleanor Mitchell's death. It was produced by an HP OfficeJet printer. A warrant for your device's serial number records has been filed with HP's Legal Compliance Division." She folded her hands. "Document fraud in Pennsylvania is a 3rd-degree felony under Title 18, Section 4101 of the Pennsylvania Crimes Code." Jared looked up for the first time. His face had the specific quality of someone who had believed, until 90 seconds ago, that he had been careful enough. Carol had her hand over her mouth. Robert's knuckles had gone white on the chair back in a way he was probably not aware of. Then Linda set her coffee cup down. She set it down wrong, her hand not quite steady, and it hit the hardwood floor with a sound too loud for the room. She did not pick it up. She looked at the table and said, quietly, not to anyone in particular, in a voice I had never heard her use before. She never said anything. In 30 years she never said one word to me about any of this. Nobody responded. Hargrove did not respond. I did not respond. The silence held what Linda had said in it without comment, which was the only appropriate thing the silence could do. It was not a defense. It was not an excuse. It was the sound of someone realizing, in real time and in public, that they had spent 30 years fundamentally misreading a person who had been standing right in front of them. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. Detective Osei confirmed the elder financial abuse investigation had been formally opened with the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office. Jared did not speak again. Robert walked to the window and stood with his back to the room until everyone had gone. I was in the entryway putting on my coat when Detective Osei stopped beside me. Her voice was low, angled away from the room. "One more account," she said. "We found it during the financial records pull this morning. Your grandmother opened it in your name, in 2009. A brief pause. The same year your father made that comment at the family dinner." I stood with one arm in my coat and November air coming through the open front door and looked at her. She gave me a card with a name and a branch address on it. Then she walked down the driveway and I stood in the entryway of my parents' house and thought about 2009, and a 2-sentence notebook entry, and a woman who had decided that same night to carry her answer. She had been carrying it for 14 years, and apparently, she had been carrying part of it in my name. Thomas Ellery had been branch manager at First Commonwealth Bank's Ross Township location for 11 years, but he recognized Eleanor Mitchell's name before Sarah finished saying it. I had called ahead, which was why he was waiting near the front of the branch when I arrived at 8:30 a.m. on November 6th rather than behind his desk. He was in his mid-50s, with the manner of someone who had worked in the same community long enough to understand that his job was only partially about money. He shook my hand with both of his, which is something people do when a single handshake cannot carry what they want to convey, and he said he was sorry about Eleanor before he said anything else. We sat at a small table in his private office off the main floor. Not at the teller windows, not at the standard new accounts desk. He had pulled the account before I arrived. The folder was already open when I sat down. She opened it on September 12th, 2009, he said, turning the folder toward me. Account number 9,921 to 0047. Custodial savings account. Named beneficiary, Sarah Ann Mitchell. Initial deposit, $500. September 12th, 2009. 10 months after my father's comment at the November dinner, Eleanor had sat with what Robert said for 10 months, and then on a September morning she had driven to this branch in Ross Township and opened an account in my name. I was 13 years old. I had no idea. I had been 13 years old, sitting at that same dinner table, and I had not remembered the comment at all. She had gone home and written it down and spent the next 10 months deciding what to do about it, and what she decided was this. She set up a standing monthly transfer the same day. Thomas said, $500, first of every month, automatic from her PNC personal checking. He turned to the next page. She never changed the amount, never missed a month. The deposit ledger was the kind of document that stops being a financial record when you look at it long enough. 168 entries, every line identical, $500, first of the month. Eleanor Mitchell running down the page in a clean column that had the particular quality of something repeated so consistently it had become a statement. Not a transaction, a position held, an argument made in the only language that could not be interrupted at a dinner table or dismissed with a tone of voice. She came in person for the first several years, Thomas said. Every month. She said she wanted a record that showed she had been here. He paused. I asked her once why it mattered whether she came in or just let the transfer run. She said she wanted to make sure the account knew someone was paying attention to it. In 2020, Eleanor spent 6 weeks hospitalized at UPMC Passavant with a respiratory infection serious enough that her doctor had suggested I prepare myself. I visited 3 times. I sat with her in a room on the 4th floor, and we talked about small things because the large things were too present to approach directly. She asked about my work. She asked whether I was sleeping enough. She did not mention, at any point during those 6 weeks, that she was calling First Commonwealth Bank from her hospital bed to make sure $500 reached an account she had opened in my name 11 years earlier. 3 months during her 2020 hospitalization, Thomas said. His voice went slightly rough on the last part of that sentence, the roughness of someone keeping something in check. She called them in by phone. I took 2 of those calls myself. She said she was sorry for the inconvenience and asked if there was anything she needed to sign. There wasn't. She thanked me and hung up. I looked at the ledger instead of at him, because I needed a moment and the ledger gave me somewhere to put my eyes. February 2020, March 2020, April 2020, $500 each. Eleanor Mitchell. On time. From a hospital bed where her doctor was telling her family to prepare themselves. The total deposited over 14 years was $84,000. With the Vanguard Growth Fund component Eleanor had added in 2015, the account value by November 3, 2023 was $127,340. It was not $12 million. It was not the trust, not the land sale, not 30 years of index fund growth. It was $127,000 built from $500 a month, opened 10 months after being told she was nothing. The trust was strategy. The trust was Eleanor's answer to the family, her 30-year rebuttal, her documentation of what they had underestimated, her quiet proof filed with a probate court. The trust was for the record. This account was for me. Did she ever say anything about why she opened it? I asked. My voice came out steadier than I expected. Thomas was quiet for a moment, looking at the folder rather than at me, the way people look away when they are deciding how much of something to hand you. Once, he said, maybe 2012. She had just made her deposit and was putting her checkbook away, and I asked what the account was for. I don't know why I asked. It wasn't really my business. He folded his hands on the table. She said, "My family sees a poor old woman. I want my granddaughter to see what a poor old woman can actually build." Then she asked about my kids and left. She took the exact words they used against her and turned them into the frame for what she was building, not in spite of what they called her, because of it. She looked at their assessment and made it the title of her argument. I need to stop here and ask you something directly. If someone in your life is being dismissed the way Eleanor was dismissed, written off, called nothing, talked about like they're not in the room, share this with them today. Because what a poor old woman can actually build is $12 million and a named endowment, and a granddaughter sitting in a bank office understanding for the first time what love looks like when it doesn't announce itself. Thomas mentioned, while returning the folder to its sleeve, that he had been contacted 3 months ago by the Pittsburgh VA Nursing Legacy Fund. Eleanor had listed him as a character reference for the endowment application. He had spoken with the fund's director, Margaret Chen, for about 20 minutes. He had told her everything he knew about Eleanor, the monthly deposits, the phone calls from the hospital, the one conversation about the poor old woman and what she could build. "I knew this moment was coming," he said simply. "Eleanor told me last August when she came in with the envelope. She said her granddaughter would be sitting in this chair before the year was out." He reached into the folder one final time and slid a small envelope across the table. Cream-colored. Sealed. Eleanor's handwriting on the front, just my name, the same small careful script, the same cream stock she used for everything formal. It was lighter than I expected, lighter than the one Hargrove had given me. I turned it over. On the back, in Eleanor's handwriting, "This one is just for you. Not for lawyers, not for courts, just for you." I held it in both hands and thought about a woman calling a bank from a hospital bed in February 2020 to make sure $500 arrived on time in an account her granddaughter didn't know existed. Thomas sat back slightly. "Margaret Chen called me again last week," he said. "The annual ceremony for the VA fund is in 10 days. She asked whether Eleanor's family would be represented. I told her I thought her granddaughter would be there." He paused. "But there's something you should know before you make that decision." He looked at the table for a moment, then back at me. "Your Aunt Carol called the fund's main line 2 days ago. I don't know what she said, but Margaret flagged the call and mentioned it to me." Another pause. "I thought you should hear that from someone who knew Eleanor before you heard it from anyone else." I sat with the envelope in both hands, and the ordinary world visible through the branch window, a sheets across the street, a gray November sky, a woman walking to her car with a coffee cup, and I understood that whatever Carol had said to Margaret Chen, the ceremony in 10 days, was not going to be a quiet, administrative event. Eleanor had planned for that too. I was beginning to understand she had planned for everything. Sarah didn't open the envelope that night, or the next. She carried it in her jacket pocket for 3 days, through 2 full shifts at Street. Mary's, where she processed insurance authorizations and sat through a budget meeting and answered 47 emails with the focused efficiency of someone who needs their hands occupied while their mind works through something it isn't ready to face directly. Through 2 phone calls with David Hargrove about the elder fraud investigation timeline, during which she took notes in the margins of a legal pad and asked precise questions and felt, the entire time, the envelope's slight weight against her ribs. Through a grocery run on the evening of November 8th where she stood in the cereal aisle for 6 minutes without moving, a box of something she didn't need in her hand. The envelope warmed through the fabric of her jacket, until a woman with a cart said, "Excuse me," gently, and Sarah stepped aside and went home with groceries she wouldn't remember buying. She was not ready. She understood that about herself without judgment. Eleanor had waited 30 years to deliver her answer. The least Sarah could do was wait until she could receive it properly. On November 9th at 6:55 p.m., she let herself into Eleanor's apartment at 419 Maple Court in Cranberry Township, with the key Eleanor had given her 4 years ago, the one that had lived on Sarah's keyring ever since without her ever stopping to think about what it meant that she was the only person outside this apartment who had one. The apartment smelled like cedar and old paper and something underneath both of those things that was simply Eleanor, the particular atmosphere of a space inhabited by one careful person for 31 years. The small lamp on the side table near the armchair had a slightly warm bulb, the kind that gives light a quality that modern bulbs don't manage to replicate, and Sarah turned it on and did not turn on anything else. The Korean War Service uniform was straight on the wall across from her, the same way it had always been in this apartment. The oak memory box was on the table beside the armchair. Sarah had retrieved it from her parents' house the morning after the family meeting, and no one had tried to stop her. She took the envelope from her jacket pocket. 3 days against her body had made the paper slightly warm and soft at the edges. She turned it over once and read the back again. This one is just for you. Not for lawyers, not for courts, just for you. Then she broke the seal and opened it. 6 pages, blue fountain pen, the same pen Eleanor had used for every piece of formal correspondence Sarah had ever received from her. The handwriting was smaller at the top of the first page, as though Eleanor had been conserving something space, or energy, or both, but it grew larger as the pages continued, like she was leaning closer to what she was saying as she went. The letter was dated November 1st, 2023, 2 days before Eleanor died. Eleanor wrote about Korea first, the field hospital outside Busan in the winter of 1952, the cold that came in under the canvas walls at night. The specific quality of that work, the pace of it, the weight of it, the things you learn about what people are capable of enduring when the circumstances require it. She wrote, I carried those 2 years in me for the rest of my life, and I never once found the right moment to put them down, because no one in our family ever created a moment where something that heavy could be set on the table, so I kept carrying it. You learn to carry things quietly when the people around you have already decided what you are. She wrote about coming home in 1953, the pension, Pittsburgh, chosen because she had trained here and it felt like a city where a person could be usefully anonymous. The decision, made at 23 years old, to invest the pension rather than spend it not from deprivation but from arithmetic. Money saved quietly, she wrote, was the only kind of independence that couldn't be argued with at a dinner table or taken back by someone who decided they knew better. Then she wrote about November 2009, Robert's comment. She quoted it the same way Hargrove had quoted it from her notebook, nothing but a poor nurse who never amounted to anything, and then she wrote, I went home that night, and I sat at this table and I thought about whether to be hurt by it. I decided I wasn't interested in being hurt by it. I was interested in answering it. There is a difference between those two responses, and the difference is everything. Then came the lines Sarah had to read twice before she could continue. They called me poor because they measured me in dollars I chose not to spend on their approval. There is a difference between having nothing and choosing differently. I had everything I needed. I simply didn't tell them. You were always the reason I built it. You were always the one who asked how I was, not what I had. That is not a small thing. That is everything. Sarah sat in the yellow lamplight in Eleanor's armchair and did not try to manage what came next. She had been managing things for 6 days. She let the letter rest in her lap and looked at Eleanor's uniform on the wall and let herself feel the full weight of being chosen by someone who had understood, with complete clarity and no sentimentality, exactly what choosing meant. I read those lines twice before I could keep going. If Eleanor's words land for you the way they landed for me, if you know someone who built quietly while the people around them looked away and called them nothing, share this today. Put their name in the comments. Tell me about them. This story is as much theirs as it is Eleanor's, as much theirs as it is mine. On the 5th page, Eleanor addressed the VA ceremony directly. She had worked with Margaret Chen at the Pittsburgh VA Nursing Legacy Fund for several months, she wrote, to arrange the endowment paperwork. She had asked Margaret to schedule the announcement at the annual ceremony, and she had asked her to send invitations to Robert and to Carol. Not to punish them, Eleanor wrote. I want to be clear about that. I am not interested in punishment. I am interested in completion. I want them in a room full of people who know exactly what this money cost me to build and chose to build it anyway, and I want them to understand finally, in a room that will not let them look away what they spent 30 years dismissing. You don't have to go. I wouldn't ask you to do something that costs you more than it's worth, but I think you will go, because you are the only one in this family who ever understood that some things need to be witnessed to be finished. Sarah folded that page carefully and set it aside. At the bottom of the memory box beneath Eleanor's service medal and the photograph of the 22-year-old woman standing straight outside a field hospital in 1952, there was a second photograph Sarah had not seen before. Eleanor and Linda, 1987, judging by the clothes and the quality of the print. They were standing somewhere outside, both laughing at something beyond the left edge of the frame, the unguarded laughter of people caught in a moment rather than posing for one. Eleanor's hand was on Linda's arm. Sarah turned it over, Eleanor's handwriting on the back, in the same small script as the letter. She used to laugh like this, before she forgot how. Sarah held the photograph for a long time. It did not forgive anything. It did not change what Linda had done or failed to do across 30 years. But it explained something about the way Linda had straightened the uniform frame twice, once the night Eleanor died, and once before the family meeting, the muscle memory of someone who had once known this woman and had, slowly, over decades, let that knowing go. The anger Sarah felt looking at the photograph was, if anything, sharper than the anger she had felt before, because it meant Linda had known exactly what she was choosing to forget. She placed the photograph back in the memory box beside the service medal. Sarah's first decision as Eleanor's trustee had come to her somewhere in the middle of the 4th page. The way certain decisions arrive not as choices but as recognitions, as things that were always going to be true once you had enough information. She called David Hargrove at 8:14 p.m. He answered on the second ring. "I know what I want to do first," she said. $500,000 to the Pittsburgh VA Nursing Legacy Fund. Eleanor Mitchell Nursing Endowment. I want it processed before the ceremony. A pause. But I need to know something first. Did the invitations to Robert and Carol go out? Hargrove's answer was immediate. Yes, 3 days ago. Carol's assistant confirmed receipt on her behalf. A brief pause. Your father Robert opened the email. Twice. Sarah looked at Eleanor's uniform on the wall. Straight, steady, the same way it had always been in this apartment, and the same way it would stay. Process the wire, she said. I'll be at the ceremony. Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall in Oakland sits on 5th Avenue like a building that has always understood its own purpose. Stone columns, high ceilings, the kind of architecture that was designed to make what happens inside it feel permanent. On the evening of November 13th, 2023, at 6:30 p.m., 200 people filled the main hall for the Pittsburgh VA Nursing Legacy Fund's annual ceremony, and the air smelled like winter wool and candle wax and the particular stillness of a room that is about to do something that matters. I wore Eleanor's navy coat, the good one she kept on the left side of her closet for occasions that required formality. It was slightly large across the shoulders and smelled faintly of cedar from 31 years in her apartment, and I did not care about either of those things. I wanted to walk into that room wearing something of hers. I wanted her present in whatever way I could manage. Thomas Ellery was in the front row. He had come without being asked, which told me everything about the kind of man he was, and everything about what Eleanor had meant to the people who had actually paid attention to her. He nodded when he saw me. I nodded back. Robert and Carol were at the back of the room. They had come. I saw them when I entered, and I did not go to them, and they did not come to me, and that was the correct arrangement for the evening. Robert was in a dark jacket. Carol sat beside him with her hands in her lap. They had opened the invitation Eleanor had arranged from beyond her own death, and they had come, and now they were going to sit in a room with 200 people and hear what they had spent 30 years failing to understand. Linda was not there. I noticed the empty space where she might have been and set it aside for later. Margaret Chen took the podium at 7:15 p.m. She was precise and warm in the way of someone who understood the weight of what her organization did and did not use careless language around it. She introduced the Eleanor Mitchell Nursing Endowment, $500,000, established November 12, 2023, and then she read Eleanor's service record aloud. Korean War, 1952 to 1953, Army Nurse Corps, Field Hospital outside Busan, 247 combat casualties treated. Commendation for service under fire, September 1953. I watched Robert's face when Margaret read the field hospital detail. He did not know. I could see it happen in real time, the information arriving and finding no prior knowledge to attach itself to. He had believed, for 84 years of his mother's life, that she had been a stateside nurse. He had not known about Busan. He had not known about the field hospital or the commendation or the 247. His face did something he could not control, something between shock and a grief that had no clean name, and I looked at it for one moment and then I looked away, because it was not mine to watch. Margaret read the quote Eleanor had designated for the endowment plaque, the same words from the letter. There is a difference between having nothing and choosing differently. 200 people heard Eleanor Mitchell's words in a room built for permanence, and the room was quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something true has been said in them. Margaret turned to me. We've never had an endowment named for a Korean War nurse before. Is there anything you'd like to say about her? Just that she was never as poor as anyone thought, I said, and she knew it the whole time. After the ceremony, Thomas found me near the entrance and handed me an envelope. Left at the front desk, before the event, he said. Sarah's name on the front, in Linda's handwriting. Inside was the 1987 photograph, the one I had found in Eleanor's memory box. Eleanor and Linda, both laughing at something outside the camera frame, Eleanor's hand on Linda's arm. I had last seen it 4 days ago in Eleanor's apartment. I turned it over. Linda had written on the back, beneath Eleanor's original note, in her own handwriting. I remembered today that she used to laugh like this. I'm sorry, I forgot. I stood in the lobby of Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall and held that photograph for a long time. It did not settle everything. It did not close the distance that 30 years of choices had opened. But it was a first word of a sentence Linda had not known how to start, and sometimes that is what beginning looks like. Before I left, I opened my banking app. The trust balance had settled after the endowment wire. $12,127,340 in my name. Built by a woman, this room had just stood for a woman her family called a burden and a government check and nothing for 30 years, while she quietly converted every dismissal into a deposit and every ignored Christmas comment into a brick in something they had never once thought to look at. Eleanor Mitchell never raised her voice. She never argued, never defended, never explained herself to people who had already decided her value. She simply kept building, with the patience of someone who understood that the most complete answer to being called nothing is to quietly, consistently, become something that 200 people will one day stand in a stone hall to honor. She never needed to say a word. In the end, the $12,127,340 said everything she had chosen not to. 200 people stood in that hall for a woman her own family called a burden. If this story made you feel something, if it reminded you of someone who built quietly while the world looked the other way, subscribe, share it, and drop their name in the comments. They deserve to be seen. Eleanor always did. Thank you for staying until the end.